going on, guys? We're back. It's episode 3. I'm starting to get the hang of this a little bit. It's been a while, but I'm starting to enjoy it. I'm going to be doing this podcast solo today. So no Danny, no guest. This is a subject I've really just been nerding out on and just studying and looking into over the past couple of months, really, since I was doing the courses that I've been doing this summer. And, it's something I think our industry needs. I think it's something our industry neglects. And I want to start the conversation. So I'm going to go out and try it out. And, I might be wrong about a couple of things here and there, but ultimately, I think it's important that we at least try to tackle this subject. So I'm going to be talking about braking forces, the stretch shortening cycle, and the role of pretension in sprinting. It's not something I've talked about on air. It's not something I've wrote a course about or anything like that. So it's relatively new. But this episode unpacks one of the most misunderstood aspects of sprinting and athlete development, which is braking forces and the stretch shortening cycle, SSC. For decades, including the time that I was in college and training in high school, it's really been focused on concentric-based strength training. And it's been treated as like the gold standard for speed and performance. There was even a book that came out about how you should eliminate all eccentric training and only focus on, concentric-only, high force, per body weight type thing. Like that stuff has been out there for a while. So the research that I've seen from Ken Clark, JB Marin, Stu McMillan talks about this, Matt Jordan talks about this, and they're all seeing the same things, that elite sprinting is really less about how much you can push and more about how well you can absorb, store, and recycle force. So I'm gonna talk through this. I might stumble a little bit, but bear with me, guys, because I think this is really, really, really important. We're going to really look at, number one, why faster runners actually produce larger braking forces, which is counterintuitive. But what we've seen is that these faster runners are actually producing higher braking forces. So it's not about minimizing force. It has to be something else. We'll also talk about the importance of pretension to really just remove the tendon slack and to set up elastic return. So it's essentially preparing for that ground contact and being in a pre-stretched position so that when you do make that initial contact, that tendon can operate the way it's supposed to without slack. We'll also talk about how tendons act as shocks and springs, two different things. And basically they protect the muscle fascicles while recycling energy. So the muscle has an isometric effect where the muscles are contracting. Alex Santera talks a lot about this, where the soleus and the gastroc, for example, on the lower limb are in a semi like isometric contraction while the soleus is stretched and stores elastic energy for the propulsion phase. We'll also talk about why force plates can give us some insights. It's, obviously it's limited because we don't have force plates on every track. Ryo Nagahara in Japan has done a ton of work with force plates on a 60-meter track. We don't all have that, but force plates can give us some global insights into how the athlete is physically managing forces, how they manage the braking phase and the deceleration part of the jump, and then transitioning into the propulsive side. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll talk about how different jumps lead to different outcomes. We'll talk about the difference between a squat jump, a counter movement jump with arms, and a depth drop are all several different things, right? They're not all the same thing, and they all illustrate the stretch shortening cycle and with different speeds and different magnitudes going into it. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about some practical interventions. Like obviously the solo pod is hard to kind of just talk through these things without visually showing you. So I'm going to talk through them on this. We'll see how far we get. And then I'm going to follow up with an actual visual and then potentially some more written stuff. So let's dive in. I've already taken up 4 minutes of time. Hopefully you haven't skipped. Let's keep going. All right. So the next piece here. So early on in my coaching career, I was reading Barry Ross. I was reading all about concentric level strength training, physical development for sprinters. So I had a track team at the time, and I basically controlled their weight room, their field, everything, their sprinting. And I only let them do concentric-only lifting. Well, at that level, it worked because they weren't very strong. And getting any level of strength allows for that strength to be used faster or whatever you're trying to do with that. You have more available strength to then carry out the task that you want to carry out. So at the time it worked, and I was biased into that thinking, hey, combine, I should do the same thing. So I had my first combine group not too long after, and it was the same flow. Like, it was concentric only lifting. It was a trap bar deadlift, drop at the top, wanted to remove all soreness. And, the truth is that we ended up getting higher jump heights. We ended up getting somewhat faster speeds. Obviously, like, combine training is not hard to get guys faster because you're actually removing the thing that makes them slower, which is tons of football practice and volume and other competing demands. If you just sprint and lifted, like, pretty much everyone's going to get faster. But that's besides the point. Guys did get faster. Guys did jump higher. Guys did jump further. But I had a lot of guys break. And I was trying to figure this out throughout the years. I'm like, maybe we need to switch our exercises. Maybe we need to have a little bit more unilateral work in there. So I tried different things. And I couldn't really find a solution. But honestly, I think back to my career as an athlete and how I trained. And the way that I trained was very concentric dominant, very power based. Like, I only wanted to do power cleans, but I caught it really high. I didn't drop down at all. I only wanted to do box squats because I wanted to eliminate the eccentric phase and as much as possible and just focus on the concentric side of things. I was just very concentric dominant. Like, and I was an average athlete. I wasn't anything special, but I was an okay athlete. I had tons of issues. I had tons of pain in my body. Always had this chronic tightness. I couldn't really figure it out. So I ran into Stu McMillan probably in 2017, 2018 during ACP, and I watched him do all these like crazy movements. At the time, I didn't understand it, but it was kind of the beginning of the reflexive eccentrics that he does, which I'll get into in a second. But one of the things that I realized during this process, and I think Stu realized with Matt Jordan as well, is that there wasn't a high correlation between the concentric-based lifting that I was doing and the athletes were doing and the outcome, which was being the fastest or best athlete on the team. There wasn't a high correlation between those things. In fact, it was somewhat of the opposite. So Stu went on to say concentric strength does not separate elite sprinters. And I agree. I think if I were to line up all the athletes that I've had that were the fastest, they wouldn't rank the highest in the concentric-based strength metrics. In fact, they're probably in the lower end of that. And as you look across sprinting nowadays, like without drugs involved in the sport, like you see a lot more body types that are elastic and smaller, and guys that you wouldn't think were very fast or could produce high forces, but they're producing extremely high forces. The forces haven't changed, right? So it's super interesting. Matt Jordan's talked about this extensively, saying the best athletes are the ones that can manage the stiffness and the eccentric braking rate of force development piece of the ground contacts, which we'll get into in a second. So super interesting. Now, Ken Clark has also confidentially told me, and now he said it on our last podcast, so it's out there, but faster runners actually produce larger braking forces. They obviously produce higher vertical forces, which is why they're faster, but they produce higher braking forces as well. And the demand required by the body with higher vertical forces is also a higher braking demand, which we'll get into in a second. So super interesting. So the core question of all this, are we focusing on the wrong things in athlete development? You look across the board, we have 225 speed labs with universal speed rating. You have tons of high schools we're working with, tons of soccer teams we're working with. I would say the general consensus around strength training is to build size and to build concentric-based qualities. So I would say, honestly, yes, I think we are focusing on the wrong things. The second core question I have is, should eccentric qualities, tendon health, and braking efficiency be prioritized along with the outputs? So I still believe outputs are good, but should we look at these things as well? Obviously, the answer is yes. So my hypothesis for today: sprinting performance equals how well an athlete can, number one, pretense, the muscle tendon unit, and I'll define what a muscle tendon unit is in a second, before ground contact. Number two, how much braking force they can apply in the initial half of the ground contact phase. That's the second most important thing. Third is how they transition from the braking through the amortization phase. So like think about the transition from braking to propulsive. So how well they manage that phase. And then lastly, how they recycle that elastic energy into propulsion. So I think sprinting has a major redefinition here in terms of what makes athletes good. Before I go on any further, I want to talk about the tendon and just like maybe the muscle tendon unit. So you have a muscle in the middle, you have two bones at the end, you have tendons that connect the bone to the muscle. So the tendon plays an interesting role. So number one, the tendon acts as a shock absorber. So when the foot strikes the ground initially and ground reaction force spikes, the muscle fibers alone could not absorb that load. Essentially, they would lengthen rapidly and probably be prone to straining or tearing, which happens. Instead, the tendon actually stretches first, and it takes on the majority of the shock of the initial impact. By stretching, the tendon reduces how much the muscle fascicles have to lengthen. So the muscles can actually be near isometric, protecting the muscle from excessive strain. This is why compliant tendons, like the Achilles, are essential. But you need some level of compliance and some level of stiffness, because that tendon has to be able to stretch. It also has to have a level of stiffness to resist the load that's coming down on top of the tendon. So it's got to be both somewhat compliant, somewhat stiff. Okay, it can't be too stiff. It can't be too compliant. Okay, the second thing is a tendon will act as a spring. Okay, as the tendon elongates, it stores elastic energy. It's like stretching a rubber band. Okay, during the amortization phase, the energy is held for a brief second. So it's a brief isometric at the tendon. And then when propulsion begins, the tendon actually recoils, returning much of that stored energy to help push the body forward. Okay, this elastic recoil improves efficiency. There's less metabolic cost, faster movement, and higher outputs. Okay, a stiffer tendon recoils faster, so it's more explosive of a propulsion. A more compliant tendon absorbs more, but may reduce elastic return if it's too loose. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about the injuries that are associated with too stiff or too compliant, right? You got to be somewhere in the middle. Okay, so it's got to be both compliant enough to absorb the shock, so reducing the muscle strain, but stiff enough to recoil quickly. All right, so too stiff means basically you're a poor shock absorber. You have poor shocks, and you have a higher calf and Achilles risk of strain. Too compliant, the energy will essentially dissipate, and the muscle fascicles will basically fatigue faster and be inefficient, which could lead to strains and other things like that. So there's a sweet spot within that, and we'll talk a little bit about the training to develop both of those later on in this podcast. Now, one thing that I should probably talk about before diving deeper into the sprinting side is that over the past couple of years, force plates have become a really good tool in terms of evaluating the stretch shortening cycle for an athlete. So if you were to just think about it simply, the stretch shortening cycle, you have an eccentric phase, you have an amortization phase, so somewhat of a switch over, and then you have a concentric phase. And if you think about a jump, the jump utilizes the eccentric forces driving down as the muscles stretch, and then you transfer that over into a propulsion. Now, if you were to think about the different types of jumps you could do a squat jump where you start at the bottom, where you basically eliminate that eccentric phase, and it's primarily concentric. You could do a counter movement jump, hands on the hips, start at the top, drop down, have a eccentric phase, and then jump regular. You could do the same thing with your arms, which adds a little bit more, I would say a little bit more speed down into that jump. Or you could do a depth jump. Now, those four are pretty interesting because each one that I mentioned is a little bit higher. So the squat jump to CMJ is higher. CMJ to with arms is a little bit higher. with arms to depth drop is a little bit higher. And they all utilize the stretch shortening cycle a little bit different. And the one factor that goes into that is speed. So the speed going into that stretch shortening cycle determines kind of what you're getting out of it. So that depth drop is actually the highest jump potentially. Like you could have some issues on some technical stuff. But yeah, that depth drop actually utilizes stretch shortening cycle the best and allows for more jump height than you would get if you were just to jump on your own, right? So we could also utilize the force plate to understand a little bit about how the tendon works, right? So an athlete that has really good breaking rate of force development is probably going to have a better utilization of their tendons because of how fast they can turn on eccentric force and how quickly they can basically stabilize that to then transfer that over and load the tendon to transfer that over to the propulsive phase. So efficient athletes will technically have a better eccentric phase, which shortens the amortization phase and have a higher elastic return. Whereas inefficient athletes will have a longer braking phase. They'll have some more time in the braking phase, essentially. They'll have a worse amortization phase and they'll have less of a spring effect. So really, like, if you think about from a training perspective, if I'm training an athlete and I know the problem is a lot of these athletes have an overemphasis of concentric output, so like chasing barbell strength and jump scores, and they neglect their eccentric and SSC qualities. They're going to have a lack of ability to amortize these forces when they hit the ground, when they're sprinting. Now, basically what we're looking at here is an athlete that's probably had too stiff of the tendons, so poor shock absorption, or they're too compliant, so the fascicles lengthen excessively, right? So I end up in two different buckets. All right, so moving on. Ken Clark's research, elite sprinters don't reduce braking. They prepare for it better with pretension and rapid reversal. So this is Ken Clark's ground speed difference, where the body's moving at 10 meters per second. The leg that's coming back into the ground is moving about 7 meters per second, and then it impacts. When it impacts, these sprinters that have higher speeds will have higher braking. Makes sense. So we had an athlete, Jacob Robinson. He came in, he ran about a 4.65, 4.67 in that range in the 40. And, you know, as a corner, 190-ish pounds, 6 feet tall, coming from BYU. We knew that he was probably going to be an undrafted free agent. So in his case, he had to run fast. Like he had to run 4.4s, 4.3s to be able to be considered to be picked up as a priority free agent and potentially make the team 53-man roster, which I hope he should in a couple weeks here. Now, when we tested him, we went through James Wild's quadrants. So we went through the, you know, basically James has identified 4 different strategies of running based on if you're ground and air based or stride frequency and length based. So you end up in one of 4 quadrants. So you could be step length and air based and be a bounder, which is an air strategy, and a step length strategy. Or you could be a step length strategy and ground based strategy, which is a driver. Or you could be a step frequency and ground based, which is a spinner. Or you could be step length and air based, which is a bouncer. So each of those abilities also has physical attributes that match up with what it takes to be good in those strategies. So Jacob in this case is a spinner. So high stride frequency, but also high ground time. And if you were to test him, let's say we took Alex Nanterre's test on the hip iso, he's got an extremely strong hip iso. So we know he has strength through his hip extensors. Now, when we did all the reactive tests, like he's okay, he's moderate. Like he wasn't great at the 10.5 RSI. He wasn't great at the drop jump. He was good enough, and he was okay with the ankle iso and those types of things. But when we looked at his force plate, the one key factor is that while he could produce a decent amount of eccentric force, decent, not great, he could not produce that eccentric force fast. So when we looked at the eccentric deceleration RFD, which is essentially, if you look at the braking phase on Vald, so it's everything from the end of the unweighting to the top where you reach your peak forces in the eccentric phase, that whole thing is braking. Now, the deceleration phase on Vald is essentially when you start producing force in that braking phase greater than your body weight. So that deceleration phase is eccentric deceleration RFD. How fast I can produce eccentric deceleration forces, how fast I can stop and switch and transfer that force from eccentric to concentric. That was really poor for him. So looking back, knowing that, we looked at the training program, like he's decently strong, but we really need to emphasize how fast he can produce eccentric forces. So you look at drops, you look at catches, you look at oscillations, you look at yielding isometrics, overcoming isometrics. We threw everything at it, right? Jacob went from a 4.65 to a 4.39 and also jumped 38 inches in the vertical jump. So he had an insane change. And really what helped him on the sprinting side is that we were able to manage the braking, which actually shortened his ground contact time and actually made him less of a ground-based runner. Now, he didn't switch over to air-based running at all, but it reduced his strategy down and also reduced some of his hip pain, because the longer you're on the ground, the more torque you're experiencing and probably the more rotation you're experiencing, and extension. And Danny Foley could probably speak to that better than I can, because I don't fully understand it. But his strategy changed and shifted into a more air-based strategy without going into air-based. Like we got him more efficiency on the ground contact, so shorten his ground contact. Another guy we looked at is River Cracraft, who we did the return to play with. We've talked about it like 5 times because it's exciting. He's on the Commanders now. It's really fun to watch. But River, in his case, he had very, very, very stiff tendons, but not very compliant. So what happened is when he's running and he has this incredible stiffness at the tendon from years of heavy concentric strength training and all of that, the muscle fascicles were put at a stretch when that was a job of the tendon, right? So he ended up with he ended up with bilateral calf strains and issues with both. And when we were looking at his force plate data, we saw that he was actually extremely good at the eccentric deceleration RFD side of things. So we knew that, okay, we need to understand that the tendon needs to be a little bit more compliant. And in the return to play process, we knew that we had to return him back to that quality that made him so good. So knowing the pre-number, knowing where he was at when he came back from the injury, we just worked towards it with reflexive eccentrics and drops and all the work that Danny was doing to get the tendon a little bit more compliant, but also loading the tendon, putting more force to the tendon, not backing off of it. So putting more force and really trying to remodel it as much as we could, and then returning him back to the eccentric braking deceleration qualities that he had. And the dude ended up running 22 miles per hour, which is one of his highest, and also having one of the highest vertical jumps that we've seen. So it's incredible. The third case that I saw in this was Brandon Jetter, bobsledder. Now, Brandon's exhausted pretty much all his available concentric abilities. Like, the dude is insane. Like, he was squatting 535 at 0.75 in a box squat the other day, right? So eventually we were like, dude, you're not getting much more out of this. He's a ground-based strategy. He's a spinner. He's got very high frequencies. He doesn't really spend much time in the air. So like the ground is his friend, but he likes to push. What we noticed on Brandon, and there's a couple other issues in here that Danny's talked to a little bit, is that he didn't manage the ground phase, specifically the first half of ground contact. And what we know about ground contacts, especially at max velocity, is that you have to spike it really hard in the first part of the ground contact to create that big spike in vertical force to manage that ground phase in the first half quicker. Now that big spike also coincides with the big braking spike as well. And if you can't manage that braking spike, then there's going to be a leak somewhere. So what Danny identified is that when he hits the ground, he has a poor post-tib reaction of the tendon. And essentially what happens is post-tib attaches to the navicular drops. So he basically pronates, his foot drops and rotates and the energy is lost. He ends up spinning longer on the ground on that one side. And then on the other side, he tries to pick it up. So he's got this really asymmetrical stride pattern that was like incredibly. It looked weird. It just looked weird. I'll show a video of it sometime. So long story short, Danny worked on the post tib and the navicular and all those things that I barely understand. And I worked on the quality that he was missing the most, which is the ability to apply large and fast amounts of eccentric force. So we did everything from drops, from 36-inch boxes to rear foot elevated catches with weight to yielding isometrics, like everything. I mean, we threw everything at it. And within a short period of time, like 3 to 4 weeks, this dude went through the roof. Like he was running, I'll just give like a quick example. Like he was running about 102 to 103 on average in his fly 10, his 20 plus 10. After a 3-week block of doing this reflexive eccentrics and isometrics and Danny's work and all that, he hit 0.94 yesterday. And not only that, like this is the piece that's probably the most surprising to me, is that in his force plate jump was like around 23 inches impulse momentum. He touched 24 once, he touched 25 once. So like most of his jumps were in the 23 impulse momentum, 23 inches. Now, yesterday he jumped 26.1 inches and he produced the highest eccentric deceleration RFD that he's produced ever. So he was able to move through that eccentric phase and rapidly reverse it, like very fast. Now, to go like into a deeper dive into this and divulge its metrics, on the propulsive concentric side, there's 2 phases to it. There's a P1 and the P2. So P1 is the first half of the propulsive phase. P2 is the second half. Well, Brandon was like 100th percentile in P2. It's like the push off. He got really good at compensating, like most athletes do, good athletes do. He got really good at compensating and over pushing in that P2 phase. So he would basically drop down in the jump and basically sink down without producing large forces and just try to muscle his way into a high jump. And actually, he got pretty good at doing that strategy. But when we added in the deceleration RFD, his not only that part got better, but P1 got better too, which is like the initial 50%. So his concentric net impulse at 100 milliseconds increased like 12%, right? And that P1 increased significantly. So it was massive, right? The other part about that is Brandon actually improved his pretension. So pretension's incredibly important, and I kind of like segue into this a little bit because it's on my list of things to talk about. But here's why pretension is important. So without pretension, essentially what happens is when you touch the ground without pretension, there's slack in the tendon. So if there's no pretension, there's slack, and basically the body has to react to that slack by reducing like the height. So basically it'll drop, your body will drop. So imagine like you have a flat foot contact and you have to absorb through the muscular effort because the tendon hasn't picked up the slack, right? Now it's not only going to cause performance decline, but also it's risky. So what pretension does is basically it switches on everything, the muscle tendon unit, before ground contact and puts it at a stretch and basically puts the muscle at the length that it needs to be at. So dorsiflexing, right, is basically going to put the backside or the soleus and the gastroc and all that is already somewhat firing before. And it's also going to put the tendon at a stretch. So when that foot hits the ground, the gastroc and the soleus are lengthened, but isometrically contracting, while that tendon can immediately go into what it's supposed to do, which is stretching and storing elastic energy. And if you think about this in the case that we talked about with Brandon, like he didn't manage that first part of the ground contact well. And there's reasons that are health related, like the post tib stuff and navicular and all that. But we knew that if we could work on teaching him through progressively adding speed into the drops and plyometrics and sprinting with a little bit of a focus on it, that we could improve the pretension strategy, that would help. So long story short, we were able to influence that. The way we did it was really dribbles, to be honest. Like, we did tons of dribbles, and we did assisted dribbles, so high speed dribbles where the 1080 was pulling him into the machine and pulling him like 19, 20 miles per hour. So it's not over speed technically, but what we're working on is just repetitively working that pretension strategy of his foot slamming into the ground with a dorsiflexed ankle, right? So initially getting into that. So with pretension, you have shorter contacts, you'll have better propulsion, you'll have better efficient recycling of elastic energy. Without pretension, they call it electromechanical delay. So it's like a soft landing, right? It's wasted energy, right? Which is kind of what he had. It's kind of like pulling back a bow and arrow before releasing it, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot here, and I know I've gone on a few tangents here. But just to summarize on the force plate side of things, there's a couple of things that we're looking at. So one, we'll look at impulse, both braking and propulsion, because that's going to be your force and time categories. You want high force, little time. For eccentric rate of force development, eccentric deceleration rate of force development, it's how quickly that force is absorbed. Concentric impulse, I mentioned, at 100 milliseconds, is essentially the power generated after braking. So the right side of the curve in the concentric. And then you have phase ratios, P1 versus P2. So it's a strategy really of like, are you early, are you generating that power early or late in that jump? And some people can produce it late if they're very strong. So another thing I want to talk through on this and just kind of to close this whole thing up is that sprinting has to do with preparation for the ground and what happens on the ground. So the preparation for the ground has a lot to do with how much can you wind up, really get a big split between your thighs, how fast can you reverse it, so the switching piece, how fast can reverse it from peak flexion extension back into the ground with a stiff ankle. And if you do that really well, you have the opportunity to create a big spike in your ground reaction force in the first half of contact, which allows you to manage the back half the front half a lot faster, but the back half more efficiently. Because if you can get the back half done more efficiently, you could start basically, you'll see, if you were to have EMG on the athletes, you'll see the hip flexors start to fire before toe off slightly, which allows the recovery to be a little bit faster to manage that rip phase, which could be honestly god awful. If you don't have any pre-activation of the hip flexors before toe off, you'll see the pelvis tilt backwards and the legs swing out behind you and put you in a bad position for the hamstrings. Like, this is where Jared Mendegucci has done a lot of his research, and Johan Latzi have done a lot of the research on that rip phase. So how the pelvis tilt can influence the strain on the hamstring during that phase. So if you think about it, it's like a cycle. So you have the attack phase. I have a high front side, and I attack down towards the ground with a stiff ankle. So if I do that really, really, really fast, I increase the forces that I get to the ground. And then you have the push phase. So if I increase the force to the ground reaction force, I can move through that phase faster. I can also overcome the braking forces quickly. And that allows me to push through where I can rip and then punch. So it all kind of works together. And what we fail to really focus on is that the most important piece of sprinting is the forces that are involved on the ground. And everything else is kind of just prepping for those forces and helping to attenuate those forces. And I think what we've misconstrued in the industry is thinking, okay, well, if it's about forces, let's just get stronger. Let's get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And failing to realize it's not only just how fast you can produce that strength, but those forces. It's also about how well you can manage the amortization, the stretch shortening cycle that's involved in sprinting. And I think it's something we should start to pay attention to. So just to recap and kind of give some practical advice on this, I think as a solution between the athlete, the coach, the therapist, we need to promote a little bit different training interventions to improve the stretch shortening cycle and pretension. So one, I'm going to start at kind of like one side of the equation. So you have yielding isometrics. So this will help with tendon tolerance under braking. So basically grab a weight, hold it in isometric position, heavy enough. It'll help that tendon adapt. You have overcoming isometrics. So it's really just the explosive stiffness and sprint specific joint angles. I like overcoming isometrics, especially at the ankle, because it puts the muscle, the gastroc and the soleus, under isometric load. And it's teaching that to contract with enough force that would be equivalent to what you experience probably in sprinting, like 3 to 4 times your body weight. And if you can get better at that, then it allows the tendon to do its job, which is stretch under load. We have reflexive eccentrics. This is Stu and Matt Jordan's work here. So rapid reversals to simulate braking and propulsion. So you're driving it with speed into the braking phase, and you're quickly trying to reverse it. It's not necessarily heavy loads, but if you try this, you could do it in season, a lot of it, because it doesn't induce a large amount of DOMs. Like you don't see a lot of DOMs in this. And the benefit of that is that you could do it with a little bit more frequency, and then you're really working on the braking rate of force development, but you're not inducing hypertrophy. It's not a big strength exposure, all those things. You also have oscillatory isometrics. So you're moving through end ranges with this, and you're playing with how to basically reverse the braking to propulsion. And then obviously you got plyos. So plyos help with the pre-activation. It helps with the stiffness side of things, and it teaches them to arrive at the ground prepared. So it teaches them how to prepare for the ground, attenuate those forces, and move into propulsion. A couple more on this. Like I took some notes before this because I've been reading up on some people that are a lot smarter than me on this. And obviously, like, I looked at Sportsmith, and there's like a ton of information from the eccentric side on Sportsmith. So I'm just going to read some of this to you. All right. So we have on the eccentric side, we have super maximal loads. So meaning loads that are heavier than the athlete can do on their own. So heavier than a 1 rep max. So this is going to really help their strength and their hypertrophy and their power. And it's really going to build that engine, the eccentric forces that the athlete can then use to move faster. From there, we have submax extenuated eccentric loading. This is going to kind of load everything. So this is like weight releasers and things like that. So maybe it's like 80 to 90% of the concentric side, but it could be 120% on the eccentric side. So strength, hypertrophy, power, rate of force development are all impacted. From there, you have flywheel loading. So it's not that flywheels won't necessarily increase the strength side of things, but hypertrophy and rate of force development definitely get impacted on this. Then you have tempo training, and this is kind of what I think most people think about eccentrics is like a slow countdown. Now, the research that I've read, and I could be wrong, is that you don't need to really go more than 2 to 3 seconds on the tempo side of things. And if you're going 5 or 6, there's a diminishing return. So this is really going to help with hypertrophy. It's really good for athletes that are learning technique and things like that. Then we have negatives where we're really just like you can lower a weight that's way higher than you can push it up, concentrically push it up. So it's loading that strength side of things, like where I'm just punishing that negative side of things. Then we have accelerated eccentric loading. So this is really going to focus on the power and the rate of force development side of things. Like I would think of this as like some band tension driving down. It's really going to attack, like, obviously you'll get a little bit of a strength exposure, but very little hypertrophy, mostly power rate of force development. Okay, then I have accelerated eccentrics. So this is, again, power, rate of force development, accelerate eccentrics. This is going to help increase my ability to reverse. So coming out of the hole, essentially. I have overspeed eccentrics. Like, imagine if I pull myself down with some bands and then rip myself out and do a concentric jump. Again, power, rate of force development. Okay, then I have my shock method, power, rate of force development as well. So plyometrics, shock method. And then I have the 2-to-1 method. So if I were to pull with both arms on the way back on the eccentric side, or sorry, on the concentric side, and then lower one arm on the eccentric, that's going to work your strength and hypertrophy. Now, I just pulled these straight from Sportsmith. And the way that I really think of this is, if I were to program and plan, I would probably use something close to Hunter Eisenhower's force system. So I would have a slow force day. So it might include some tempo or super maximal loads that are focused on strength hypertrophy. Then I would have a high force day where I'd work on more of the shock method. So dropping into from high speeds into a really big high force. It might be rear foot elevated drops, overcoming isos. In the slow force day, I would do yielding isometrics. On the high force day, I would do more overcoming isometrics. And then you could have a fast force day, which would be more reactive based stuff, and maybe some overspeed eccentrics and things like that. So, I'm not going to speak for Hunter on this. Like, we've probably only spoken through social media, but I would recommend just checking out his force system, his podcast, Move the Needle, if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But it's been a huge help for me to kind of conceptualize and put all this stuff together. But yeah, that's pretty much all I got on this subject, man. This has been the source of the past couple of weeks, staying up late and trying to understand this piece, and trying to understand the idea of stiffness, right? Because when we think of stiffness, we think of just global stiffness. Like, you hit the ground, it's stiff. Well, the stiffness that we're looking for is actually the muscle during the eccentric and amortization phase is contracting hard enough to really stay isometric, while the tendon does have some compliance to it and is able to stretch. It's not completely stiff, doesn't move all together, and that creates a stretch reflex that then creates the propulsion. So understanding how the muscle tendon unit works with the lengthening and the shortening, it's a little bit different than I once understood. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. Ken Vick has also talked a lot about this with shocks and springs. He's been posting some really good stuff on Twitter. I'm gonna try to get him on the podcast pretty soon. Matt Jordan is another one. I suggest looking at his courses online. They've been a huge help for me in understanding. Like, I bought pretty much every course. Like, it's helped me understand just the force plate side of things and just how the shortening cycle is utilized in the force plate. And we can see things in there that we wouldn't be able to see with just concentric-only outputs. Yeah, that's all I got, guys. Make sure you guys not only just watch this episode, but you subscribe to the podcast and then tweet about it. Get more people, send it to 2 or 3 people. That's how it grows. I'm starting to dedicate almost all my time to the podcast world and digital world. So this is now how I feed my 3 kids. So this is really important. It means a lot to me if you guys share, comment, start a discussion. Even if you disagree with something, it's cool. Like, just don't be disrespectful, because I gotta get on your ass. But otherwise, like, I love the discussion. I love disagreements and things that are healthy and educational and help me learn, because this is all a learning process for me. So appreciate you guys a ton. Let's hop back in next week. I got a couple guests that you guys are going to be like, how did you guys get this dude on there? So I'm really excited about this, man. So thank you guys again, and we'll talk soon. Peace.